Most people know the story of Britain during the Second World War. The Blitz, evacuation, rationing, victory in Europe. But few know of the British families who were taken from their homes and sent to prison camps in Nazi Germany. Not soldiers or spies, but mothers, children and grandparents. Among them, thousands from the Channel Islands, including my own family.
I was terrified all the time, Ollie, to be honest. I think it's sort of all these orders and shouting and you must do this. You were scared to do anything wrong. And I think that's what terrified me, really. I didn't want to do anything wrong. Because if I did, I didn't know what would happen.
That's my grandma, Jill Chubb. She was one of the Guernsey Deportees, a group of islanders sent away to Biberach internment camp in 1942. Imprisoned and in squalor, it was in these barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, that she, along with the other deportees, spent 3 long years of her life. Just a handful of those who lived through this life-altering experience are still alive today, and this podcast is dedicated to preserving their memories.
Everybody suffered in the war, and I think it's about time that they knew our story and what we suffered in the camps.
I'm Ollie Guillou. When I first released the Guernsey Deportees, I never expected just how much this story would grow. For this special release, I've brought the full story together into one complete feature. If you're joining from the Guernsey Deportees feed, consider subscribing to my other history podcast, What We Did Before, where we explore the forgotten ways humans lived before the modern world. Now, I first interviewed my grandma about the deportation during my time as a journalist at BBC Radio Guernsey. Since then, I've always wanted to dig deeper into her story, to understand the true extent of what she and her fellow islanders went through. And now, more than ever, it's clear that time is running out. Even since beginning conversations to get this podcast in motion, a number of Guernsey deportees have sadly died. So that's why the time is now to tell their tale. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Guernsey, it's a gorgeous little island nestled between France and the south of England, sitting next to Jersey in the English Channel. It's part of the British Isles but has its own government, and it's a beautiful holiday destination.
You think of Guernsey, you think of tomatoes, of course, and you think of the greenhouses that were here. An idyllic life, yes, but it was tough for some people.
That's Guernsey-based historian Matt Lucas. The First and Second World Wars have been a passion, obsession of his for more than 40 years.
These things we tend to look through with very sentimental eyes, but it was at times tough, but generally very pleasant, a big sense of belonging, a big sense of community, a big sense of things not changed or have not changed for generations. The old traditions are still very much carrying on as they had done for hundreds of years, with certain things changing, but generally not a huge amount. The impact of the First World War, of course, was still acutely felt.
And while, as Matt explains, life in the islands was difficult at times, the worst was yet to come. On the 1st of September 1939, World War II began, a war that would leave a lasting impact on the Channel Islands.
When war breaks out, it's similar in a lot of respects to the mainland. Air raid precautions, the air raid wardens would be out, thinking of air raid shelters, military installations. There was obviously quite a few all over the island, and it did all over the islands. And that built up expecting a war maybe similar to the First World War. And then, of course, May 1940, once the Germans attack really through the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, and into France, then you get a difference there between here and the UK, because you start obviously getting evacuees coming from France ahead of that German invasion that are starting to tell stories of what's happening. You hear these stories back in the UK, but you're actually speaking to people that, were on the receiving end of the German blitzkrieg. So there is a a sense of worry, a sense of something is coming and it's not going to be nice. But they're not going to imagine that what happens actually happens.
After the fall of France in 1940, the British government decided the Channel Islands were indefensible and demilitarised them. This left the islands vulnerable, and in June 1940, German forces started to occupy them.
Civilian population is kept away from certain areas. Curfews I've mentioned, but obviously you can't go walking around some of the camps. You can't just go walking around the German defences and the defences you see on the coast. Of course not. You can get about quite a few places, but are you going to have your own vehicles? No, the Germans have commandeered those. You see a difference with the defences, that the fortress or Festung Guernsey starts to be created, and then you see a change in the population. You have a lot of forced labourers, paid labourers, slave workers. It's a big mixture of different people that will come to the islands. Well, obviously they fortify the coast, they're building batteries inland, they're making those temporary defences permanent.
By 1942, the war had been raging for 3 long years, and Guernsey had been under German occupation for 2 of them. Then came the devastating news, an order for deportation. Adolf Hitler had issued the order in retaliation for the Allies' internment of German civilians. It was also a tactic to increase leverage in prisoner exchanges and bolster the war effort by using civilian labour. The order targeted specific groups: British citizens who had moved to Guernsey from the mainland, Jewish people, and anyone the Germans deemed a threat to their war effort.
Hitler decided that for every German prisoner, he would take 10 English men from the Channel Islands for every one German. So because my father was born in England, he's about 6 months when he came here with my gran, in the First World War, he was still English. So that's why we had to go. It was a reprisal for something they'd done. And he said, OK, you take people from here.
But what exactly was it about being British that made you a target? Standing in his room adorned with World War II memorabilia, Matt told me it all begins with an event that happened thousands of miles away from this small island community.
In Iran, of all places. The British and the Russians have an agreement, and they want to remove the Germans that are in Iran. Iran is a neutral country and has been working with Germany as a neutral country. It's perfectly entitled to, for goods and all sorts of commercial things. So there's quite a few Germans living in Iran. A number of them are military age. Iran's next to Iraq. The British control Iraq. There's been an insurrection earlier in 1941 and that the British put down, and that has been backed by the Germans and the Italians to a lesser degree. And on the other side, of course, you have Soviet Russia. Iran is a bit of a potential problem. The British have approached the Iranian government, the Iranian authorities, Persia, of course, as it is at the time. They were very reluctant to start with, but eventually they agree. And these Germans are deported mainly, in the end, to Australia. So they're out of the picture. It's a bit of a, we can breathe now, Britain and Russia. That problem of Iran, a potential problem, has gone. Adolf is not a fan of this. Obviously, he is very annoyed. How dare the Allies interfere with a neutral country? That's something obviously Hitler wouldn't have done. So how can he get back at the Allies? Right, we need to do exactly the same. But the only part of the British Isles that the Germans controlled is, of course, the Channel Islands. But actually, there's no free movement in the Channel Islands for the civilian population. They're interned anyway. So what can they do? There is a loophole. They can actually get the British, the people in Guernsey and Jersey, that were not born in the Channel Islands, actually born in the UK, and those that were caught up by the movement of war, 1939-1940, that their permanent address wasn't in the Channel Islands, they could deport these. Hitler wishes to have 10 British people deported for every German that was deported from Persia. This is not practical. And the whole thing takes quite a while to actually be implemented. But 1942, it is started. There are over 2,000 people from the Channel Islands deported, and well over 1,000 from Guernsey and Sark. Most of those end up eventually in Biberach. There's a number of other camps. So the initial deportations, really, 1942.
The deportation order tore families apart and people were given very little notice. My grandma was just 3 years old when her family was told they'd be leaving.
My name is Jill Chubb. My maiden name is Wild, Jill Wild. I was born on 1939 in September the 16th. I was a week into my 3rd year before we went to Germany. That was in 1942. The first thing I really remember, my mum told me we were going on holiday, so I packed my little bag and we went down to the Gaumont cinema. I didn't realise it was cinema, I knew it was something, but we came home again. I was really disappointed. I thought we were going on holiday. Anyway, we did, eventually, but it was to Germany. It was about September the 23rd when we set sail.
At this young age, Grandma, she wasn't very tall. She had curly blonde hair. It grew darker over time though as she got older, much to the dismay of the Germans. She was thin but had strong little legs and she could run fast. Her father used to make her rope sandals, but she was never that keen on them. She wasn't used to wearing shoes and socks, something that hasn't changed much even now. Now, despite that initial failed attempt to leave the island, her family was finally deported on the 23rd of September, 1942.
The reason why they couldn't go, first of all, because there was a storm and there were U-boats around, they had to be careful. We got aboard a cargo ship, and I remember going down into the hold. There's straw bales and paraffin lanterns, very smelly. And then they closed the top doors on us. They were sitting in the hold, basically. And I was a bit scared. My dad said, there's nothing to be worried about. And my mother had my brother.
Ralph Godwin is one of the Guernsey deportees, and he was a very similar age to my grandma when he was sent away on that cargo ship.
I'm Ralph Godwin, and I'm 86. And I have a twin brother who grew up with me, is no longer with us, unfortunately. So I'm carrying his memories as mine as well. But we're similarly inclined to see the same side of things. And in that way, as men do, we tend to look at the rough and tumble side of life rather than the sweet side of life. I can remember that we did start to go one day and we went down to the White Rock and then we were told to go back because there's something wrong with the boat. The next day we went down and we went and got on this boat. It was quite a rough day and my parents were neither of them very good sailors. We two boys eventually ended up on the top of the boat with a man, and I can't remember his name, who used to own the Fermain Tavern, or run the Fermain Tavern, because I had, since the war, talked to him about it. And he said, I looked after you two boys, your parents weren't any good, so when you sailed into St. Malo, he said, they appeared again. We got on the train from St. Malo. It took 2 days to get to the Rhine. We stopped overnight somewhere south of Paris first time, and the next night we were on the banks of the Rhine at Cologne. I have looked at my mother's diaries one day, and she made the comment that what a lovely train journey it was. But whether that was her sense of humour, I don't know.
So I guess some of the memories that you have from early on where perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily remember things like that. It's a bit of you and your brother kind of piecing together pieces of a puzzle.
But yes, and also geographically, I've always been interested in what's going on outside the window and what part of the country we're in. Never having been to France, and of course, at that age, it was very intriguing and interesting. So the train journey went, but it certainly lasted 2 days before we got to the Rhine. And then we moved across the Rhine and went up to Dorsten, which is northeast of the crossing of the Rhine, just the other side of Düsseldorf.
We'll come back to Dorsten. It's an important part of this journey to Biberach. But for now, I'd like to share with you a lasting memory of the beginning of this trip, something my grandma showed me, her parents' identity cards.
They all had identity cards.
These are little yellow one-page booklets with identity card written on the front with the German underneath. Inside are pictures of her father and mother, wonderfully preserved mementos that took my breath away.
This is your great-grandmother. That's Molly. That's my mum. I think she's about 24. Somebody gave her this saying up here before she went.
Yeah, it looks like it says,
Yeah.
when thou passest through the water,
Yeah.
I will be with thee.
Yes.
Isaiah.
Yeah. So they gave that to Mum before she went away. And this is my dad, Ollie's great-granddad, and John.
I've never seen a picture of him before.
No. Good looking, eh? Just like you, darling. Can I say that? Yeah. Yeah, and that's my dad. Here you
That's
are.
amazing.
He had blue eyes and black hair. And this is a stamp in German they stamp the cards with. It's nice to show you that because they deserve to be honoured. Really pleased.
Every one of the civilians were issued one of these before they went to Germany. But my question is, why was this even allowed to happen? I mean, why did the UK agree to Hitler's terms and allow for those people to be taken prisoner from Guernsey?
There wasn't really a lot that the British could do. Although, people had been deported before, but for specific crimes, inverted commas, acts of resistance, etc., which was quite a normal thing to do in wartime. But there was very little the British could do. You could protest, but you can't attack the islands, you can't attack the shipping. The British do attack shipping, of course, but that's on a military level, that's very different. And certainly the locals, if we look at the local government, was obviously against it, but there was very little that they could do. They're totally outnumbered by the Germans. Interesting, the German military is not in favour of this at all. And when you speak to people that were deported, that were of an age to remember it, they will tell you that the German soldiers are quite upset with this. And I can remember some of the people that were deported saying to me that Germans actually came up to them and said, "We are sorry about this."
Why?
This is not what we wanted to do. They felt that the British and Germans should get on. This is not the way to treat the civilian population here. This is a model occupation. People getting on, generally speaking. As my friend said, no real Nazis here. So having 2,000 people deported was not on.
It was just a statement piece. It was to prove that he could retaliate because, like you said, they were interned anyway.
Yes, I mean, they're interned anyway. The civilian population, it was this little loophole. Hitler's island madness, the Channel Islands are fortified beyond all military sense. It's the only part of Britain that the Germans have, British Isles, that the Germans are in possession of. And certainly controlling that part of the civilian population, it's symbolic. It's Hitler having his little bit of revenge.
Now, we've heard Matt say a few figures regarding the number of people who were deported. 2,000 across the islands, about 1,200 from Guernsey. But we don't actually have an exact number of how many people were sent away.
It's never been exact to the nearest person because there were people who few people committed suicide before they went. There were a few people who didn't turn up for the boats. There were a few people who had last-minute exemptions. And so there's never been an absolute figure. You can actually say this is 1,124 people were deported throughout the Channel Islands. No, you can't say that.
That's my grandpa, Alan Chubb, who shared in my grandma's journey for a long time and is in fact the secretary of the Guernsey Deportees Association. Now, it's quite horrifying to know that some people thought there was no alternative other than to end their own lives rather than be deported. But while we knew the war ended and the Allies won, people at that time didn't. And the thought of what might happen to them if the Germans won, well... For Janet de Santos, her deportation story is quite different for a variety of reasons. Firstly, she was much younger when she was deported, so much of what she knows are the things that she was told by her parents. But also, the journey that led Janet and her family to leave the island was all the more complex.
My mother was Jewish, so that rather complicated things a little. It was only my mother and myself who were supposed to go, but my father insisted on coming with us. My father was a locally born person, but didn't need to go, but came. Unfortunately, we were split up originally. We didn't go to Biberach to begin with. My mother and I went to Compiègne in France, which was a transit camp where mostly people were sent prior to going to extermination camps. And my father was sent to a place called Laufen, which was where British men were. It was a camp for men only. I obviously don't remember anything about it, but I mean, for my mother, I should imagine being an Austrian Jew, it must have been pretty awful. I mean, I've been there myself. I visited it, and it was within walking distance of the railway station. It was a place where a lot of the French who had been in the resistance movement, if they were kind of arrested, they were put there, and then they were walked down to the railway station and then sent to extermination camps. So the road between the camp and the railway station is marked by footprints on the road as something to remind people of what happened there. But eventually we were kind of sent on to Biberach and reunited with my father.
So was the intention that she was to be sent on to an extermination camp?
She had kind of left Vienna with two friends when the Germans had invaded Vienna. Well, in fact, just before they invaded, I presume. And they had somehow come over to Guernsey, these three women, and they got themselves jobs with Guernsey families as kind of housekeepers. And my mother was in a house in Cobo in Guernsey and met my father, and they got married, and I was the result.
Fortunately for Janet and her mother, either the British or Guernsey authorities managed to get them transferred to Biberach rather than an extermination camp, because her mother was British by marriage, but her mother's friends were sadly not as fortunate. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how on earth does anyone remember what happened to them at the age of 3? Well, I put this question to Grandma.
Because it made such an impact on my life, probably. That's the only thing I can put it down to. But I mean, I've still got a good memory. And still inquisitive, want to know bits and pieces of what's happening now. So as a child, I can imagine that, yeah, that's me. I just can remember. I mean, some people went there and can't remember a thing. And I can't understand it. But I mean, that's my makeup.
And it makes sense. The brain makes connections more strongly under certain conditions, like trauma, for instance. And her ability to recall these memories was really demonstrated when, decades later, she revisited Biberach with my grandpa. first, I want to tackle Dawston. You'll have heard that name come up a few times. Dawston was an internment camp that the deportees spent time at on their way to Biberach. And by all accounts, it was a terrible, nasty place.
We're hungry. It's so dark all the time, it's unbearable. I'll never forget it, and I'll never go back to Dawston. I'd sooner cut my throat.
It was just a few short weeks, a pit stop, a fleeting visit. So why did it elicit such a fervent response?
It was a terrible, dirty, dark place. Everything was filthy, and it's muddy and dirty and smelly. We had to stand in the mud. Eventually we got a room to stay, and the women apparently had to scrub the place because it was so dirty, and there were bed bugs. It was hungry, we're hungry. And it's so dark all the time, it's unbearable. I know there was a canal along the side, I knew that, because it was always, there were all puddles in the camp where, I don't know, the rain, I suppose, and I was always frightened about this canal because it's higher than the actual camp. And then you get all these smells coming from wherever, and people, you couldn't clean yourself. Your skin was always dirty, from soot and things like that, and you couldn't get clean. Anyway, apparently we were there for 6 weeks. I knew it was a length of time, but it was a bit long. When you're little, time goes slowly, not as fast as when you get older.
Speaking to me with a stern fervour, it was an incredibly moving experience hearing my grandma recall her memories. Though it happened so many years ago, these experiences have shaped her and have shaped the lives of all of the Guernsey deportees. And although Dawston is just a small piece of this journey, and Grandma remembers very little about her brief stay at the camp, the experience was impactful enough that she has chosen never to visit the camp again, despite having been back to Biberach. Though she did tell me a little story about Dawston that sounds almost sweet.
We met a man, Keith and I, we were wandering around the camp.
Keith was her brother.
He built a shelter. He was cooking something in the ground and it was steaming and it looked fascinating. We wondered what as kids. And he said, "I'll show you," he said. And he pulled off the turf of the ground and it was a hedgehog. He cooked a hedgehog. It was like a pressure cooker, I suppose. He cooked it in the ground. And he pulled it up and he pulled the skin back just like that. And it's pink meat. And he said, "And this is what you do to survive." Whether I ate it, I don't know. I know he certainly did. But we went down there again and we didn't tell my father or mother about that. We went down again and he showed us how to survive on stumps.
Stumps, in case you're wondering, are basically the bits of a vegetable you'd usually cut off. Think the root end of a carrot or the tough ends of celery stalks.
It was a dump. They threw all their rotten cabbage away and anything like that. And he showed me how to clean it, how to clean the stumps ready to eat. And they were delicious. I mean, they were delicious. But when my father found out, he was furious and he said, "You're not to do that again. You're not to go down there and see that man again." But even to this day, I like stumps. Any sort of stumps. I love them. Can't get enough. So Alan knows that. So it's my favourite diet, stumps. Give me a stump and I'm happy. Anyway, that's my first recollection of going away.
The odd thing about their trip to this horrendous camp is they never meant to be there in the first place. Here's Grandma's husband, my Grandpa Al, secretary of the Deportees Association.
The deportees turned up there and there was just absolutely nothing ready for them. They had to do their own building. They had to make the place wind and watertight where they were barracked. They were just given straw to sleep on, full of lice and bed bugs. There were no separate facilities for men and women. There was no facilities for women at all, no privacy. The camp commandant I don't know if it's the first one or the second one, was quite sympathetic and allowed the men to build some installations, if you like, and get some water running. But it was a terrible place.
We obviously didn't have much we could do, so it was just existing, I would say, Dawston was. In the end, of course, Hitler realised that we were not in the right place, and we should be he wanted us in a better camp. Eventually we moved south to Biberach, which again was a 2-day trip.
So if, as Ralph and Grandpa say, Hitler never meant for the deportees to go to Dawston, what happened? Why did they end up there?
Well, I think that was because it was such a rush.
Oh.
That was a consequence of the fact that nothing was planned, really. Dawston was a holding camp. It had been used for that purpose since the war started, and maybe even before the war, while the Germans were fighting the Russians and the Slavs. So it had been used as a prison camp, but only for transit purposes, and it was a terrible place. A terrible place. Not many deportees even who do remember it will actually talk about it, because it was. And being the first place, I suppose, made it even worse, going from your normal home into a place like that. The shock of the whole thing would have been horrendous. And a few people died there again.
You know how horrible it is without having been there, so you must have had an incredible picture painted throughout the archiving process.
I have, yeah, and also through Gilly Carr. Dr. Gilly Carr went over there last year. She was representing the association, and that really was the first contact they'd had with Dawston. But it was, from what Gilly Carr has told me, it was quite an experience for her to do that, and it affected her deeply.
So Grandpa mentioned Dr. Gilly Carr there. Well, she's probably the world's foremost expert on the subject of the deportation. She's been interviewing survivors and their families since 2006, and her recent book, A Materiality of Internment, explores the lives of those deported from Guernsey and Jersey through objects, artwork, letters, diaries, and memoirs. And as Grandpa said, she has been back to Dawston.
I've been back to all of the camps now, and when I was writing my book, for many years it was always Biberach and Würzburg, and I've been to Liebenau as well, because that's where the majority of the internees were from, and also the majority of those who are still alive were from. So when I was writing my book, I realised that I needed to go and visit all of the camps, because it really helps as a researcher to physically go there. That was really important. But when I went to Dawston, the site today, in a way there's very, very little to see. I went on the 80th anniversary of the deportees arriving, and my aim was to lay flowers on the graves of those who died and to go to the site of the camp and to get a sense of a feel for the town and a feel for the area around the camp, because there were a couple of sketches surviving from Dawston, and I wanted to be able to see what the deportees could see, and when they described the environment in which they were living. In order to really get that, I had to go and see it for myself. For example, there's a canal that runs past the camp. A high embankment was built above the area of the camp, and so when the ships go by in the canal, or the boats go by in the canal, it's 20-30 feet above ground level, if I can put it that way. It sounds I'm not being very eloquent, but basically the deportees were very worried that if the canal was bombed, then all the water would pour into the camp and they would drown. And I needed to go and see that geographically. So today, the area where the camp was is a place where there's a sort of senior citizens shooting range where they go with their and do archery. And there's a couple of buildings still standing, which today are social housing, but they are camp buildings. I'm an archaeologist, and so I'm used to always looking at the ground and looking for traces in the ground. And you could see the concrete platforms of where the huts were, with the odd bit of brick wall. And I was looking on the ground for artifacts. And actually, I'm just looking over to my shelves because I have a piece of drainage pipe from the camp that I picked up and brought home. Anyway, so you asked about the visceral experience. Certainly when I went to the cemetery to lay flowers, I was due to meet the Burgermeister and his second in command, and they held a little ceremony in the cemetery with me, along with the local archivist. And I'd come along with some speeches from Guernsey to read out and from the deportees. And I just started crying. And it's almost like you can feel the emotions of people who were once there. And because I was representing the deportees and reading out their speech, and I could sort of feel the emotions from that, and somehow almost feel the emotions of those who were there 80 years ago. And so it was a very emotional experience.
I really loved how Gilly spoke about how her desire to go to Dawston was because she had sketches and she wanted to see if they matched the reality of what the place was really like. Gilly is a big believer in the power of objects and heirlooms and their ability to shed light on the events of the past. She's learnt about and collected many during her years of research. And even though the deportees spent just that small amount of time at Dawston, a few items survived.
Some of the artwork would appear to be, here's a picture of a wood. Here's a picture of a pathway through a wood with a little sign in the mid-distance saying Dawston this way, with some buildings in the far distance. And, you know, is this drawn from the imagination or is this real? And so going to Dawston myself and deliberately walk, so the camp is out of town, but walking from the area of the camp into town, I suddenly walked into an area where I thought, this is the area I can see in the drawing. And to be able to know, okay, so that was really drawn from life. That was a real drawing and not from the imagination. And also, okay, but what is a deportee doing out of camp drawing this? And then in one diary, someone had written about when it came time to leave the camp, to move on to the next camp, some deportees were put in buses to the train station and some of them walked under escort. And you could be like, well, this person walked under escort, I can see it, that's the view they were getting. But then at the bottom of the drawing, it said something like Biberach, December 1942. So that person had kept the view in their mind, but drawn it when they arrived in Biberach and could get hold of paper and pens to begin to draw. And that taught me that sometimes objects made in a camp are made in the next camp when they have pen and paper and whatever to draw things. And that was an important discovery. But also when I went to Dawston in person, I saw for myself its industrial history. And some of the deportees had talked about it being polluted. But when I went myself and I could see there was an old coal factory processing place, not even a kilometre from the camp. And it's sort of a heritage, you know, there's some sort of heritage elements there today you can go to as a tourist. And somehow it clicked more in my head to be able to see in the landscape how close the coal processing plant was. And so when deportees talk about all the coal dust in the air and their clothes going black and their skin going black, and one of them made a little golly in Dawston. And on the one hand, you might dismiss it as saying, oh, well, this is an old-fashioned racist toy. But on the other hand, this golly was representing to them with its, you know, no matter the racist undertones, this was representing, in a way, a bit of camp humour, that the coal dust is turning their skin black and their hair black and their clothes black. And here's a doll which represents that experience and that feeling. And sort of going to the camp made a lot of things fall into place in my mind, and I could understand the objects and the artwork better. And at its core, the book is about when we no longer have deportees around to tell us about the experience, how can we understand their artwork and the objects that they made? And I've studied over 100 collections of these things, whether personal collections or in museums and archives. And so it's about being able to understand and interpret these things. And so going to the camp really enabled me to begin to understand the objects made in Dawston much better. And so that's why it was vital to go there.
You mentioned the wonderful story of the golly that they created. Were there any other interesting, it was a very short period of time, other interesting objects or artwork from Dawston that you can tell us about?
I mean, from Dawston, there's very few. So I mean, that doll and the artwork, I think, are some of the only objects. The person who owned that Golly doll also owned a doll made in the early days of Biberach, and that doll, so the Golly doll was called Billy Dawson, and the doll made in Biberach was called Biberach. And Bibby was a little white doll, and she had blonde hair, and she was sort of dressed Heidi style. And so it was really marking the contrast between the clean air and just the feeling of cleanliness after the filth of Dawston, even though no camp is clean, but it was a comparative statement. And because I was in Dawson at the same time of year as to the day that the deportees were sent away, I was able to sort of experience the weather and to sort of see what the climate is like in that part of Germany. And when the deportees were writing about the rain clattering on the roof and leaking between one of the barrack blocks was falling apart and the water came in, and it was just a miserable experience. I think the physical experience of having visited, and I made a point of walking from the camp to the train station, which is a few kilometers. And I think experiencing that for yourself, just the sort of, gosh, this is a long walk, and gosh, this is really quite fatiguing, and gosh, it's cold. And it sort of helps you when you're reading diaries and memoirs, you're drawing upon your own experience of having made that same walk. But of course, they had 7 weeks of malnutrition, and, they didn't necessarily have the right clothing for the weather. And it just sort of adds that extra atom of understanding to be able to do that walk yourself.
While Dawston may have been far more destitute than Biberach, the deportees weren't there long. It was just a small step on the road. They were soon carted off once more.
The Allies were bombing, and I knew there were bombs going off because we were in industrial Germany, we were in the Ruhr. We were taken out of the camp, and we were on more cattle trucks. We had cattle trucks, and my father and mother, they separated the men from the women, children, like you do see. And my father ran ahead, and there was a door open of this cattle truck, and my mother's screaming, my brother's holding onto her hand. It's chaos. Anyway, my mum ran to my dad, and he pulled us aboard. We were very lucky. I think some people didn't make it, apparently, but we certainly did. But we sat again in enclosed thing with a grill at the top. There's a small grill, and that's all you could see. You could see the sky and a bit of sun, and you sat there, and no facilities whatsoever for doing anything. So that was done in a hole. And I remember doing that. So we were there for a couple of days in the cattle truck before we got to Biberach.
Although the deportees may have been venturing somewhere objectively better and more sanitary, Biberach was by no means a paradise. For all the worldly possessions taken from them there, the worst thing that was stolen was their freedom.
The huts were overcrowded. Families, initially the men of course are separated, but families packed together. Boredom. You're in another country, you're in the enemy country, you have no freedom. How precious is freedom?
In Biberach, it was cold when we got there, in November. I didn't know the month, so it was very cold. And my dad had cut the toes out of my shoes because my feet were growing. And and then walking up the hill, of course it was snowing, so my feet were getting pretty wet.
Yeah. Frostbite on your toes.
I know, yeah. But that's what they had to do. You see, they had to improvise for their families to help them. And they all did that. And the women did as well in the camp. But anyway, we walked up this massively long hill. I never thought it was going to end. We got to the top, and there's a Hitler Youth camp on the left, and they were spitting us. And because I wanted to spit, of course.
Not you.
And my mother saying, "Don't do that, Jill. Jill, come on." I don't. So I was always like that, I think. Anyway, we eventually got into Biberach, and they stood us in the square, counting us for hours. And they kept recounting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, with the 5. with the fifth person. Children were getting fed out and running around. I wasn't one of them, I must say. Apparently a couple of people had died in Dawston, Manning and a little boy, and they kept miscounting because they'd missed the dead. They expected more people. Anyway, we got into the barrack eventually, and I was in barrack number 3. We found a room where there was another family, which happened to be Ralph and Neville and his mum. So there's Mum, my brother Keith and me, and we shared the room through the wall in Biberach.
As Grandma says, Ralph Godwin and his family were there with them in barrack room 3, second row from the main gate.
And we were at the far end of that barrack because the other end was the end, where you went down the end.
What did you do down the end?
We went to the toilet. To go down to the toilet was a cold experience in the winter.
Before Biberach, Mrs. Wilde and Mrs. Godwin had never met before. Who'd have expected that all these years later, their children would still be in contact, standing in the same room regaling these tales? So, in Ralph's room was a window that faced the door on the left, and to his right were the Wildes.
And that remained the same for the next 2.5 years. And there was a table down the middle, there was a hot stove with a chimney stack out of it, which was our heating arrangement.
It sounds almost cosy. But despite Ralph's surprisingly cheerful demeanour, we mustn't forget this was a prison. Eyes were on you at all times, and it was unclear whether you'd ever leave.
I looked out of the camp I was in, at the barbed wire and stuff, and I could see fields and the mountains. And I think one day I'm going to run. I just want to get out of here and run. Just want to be free. And I think that's the thing that really hits you. You're confined into this small space with all these people, no privacy, except we were fortunate with our room. Otherwise, there's loads of people in one room, and it's very, very difficult. The different women, with their different problems. And
this sense of confinement was made worse by the view out over Biberach, a beautiful vista looking out over the Alps, which caught the eye of the people who were detained at the camp before the Guernsey deportees arrived. You see, Biberach didn't start out as a place for families.
Camp at Biberach was, as some of you will know, is a pre-war German barracks, which is never really used as that. Because in 1939, it then housed Allied prisoners of war officers, British and French, etc., from 1940, under reasonable conditions. And some of those original deportees said, the conditions actually were quite okay.
But that soon changed for the new wave of deportees. The huts became overcrowded, families were torn apart, boredom set in, and their freedom was taken from them. It's hard to imagine how locked down these Guernsey families must have felt, how oppressive it must have been.
I used to sit on the step by the gate, and I used to see these men coming in, frightening, very smart but frightening, shouting. Yeah, they shouted all the time. I hate to be shouted at, even now. And it's Rouse, Oplagen, Rouse, Anglino, no good, Kaputen, and all that sort of stuff, There's an administration block there, apparently, and they used to come in, the Gestapo and the SS men, and they used to go in the administration. But at the camp, they had the proper towers, with the machine gun at the top and all the searchlights. I never believed that, but searchlights used to keep me awake. So my mum put a blanket up, and I think with Ralph's mum as well. And I had the bottom bunk below my mother. But it was so dark, and I used to have these awful dreams of things floating in the air towards me. So I used to climb up about to a bunk, and I used to say, "Where's you mummy? Where's you mummy?" And they had to stop me because they was frightened that I'd break my leg or fall or something.
What terrified you most while you were there?
I was terrified all the time, Ollie, to be honest. I think it's sort of all these orders and shouting and you must do this. You were scared to do anything wrong. And I think that's what terrified me, really. I didn't want to do anything wrong. Because if I did, I didn't know what would happen. So yes, I think I wasn't happy at all, really.
But Guernsey people being who they are, stubborn donkeys, they just kept going. And though they lived life under lock and key, life ticked on. And there were many days which were normal, mundane even. So I'd like to paint a picture of day-to-day life in Biberach.
The men were in a separate part of the camp, and the women and children were in another part. There was a curfew, so they were used to meet when the curfew, they were allowed to meet then. But when it was curfew, about 7 o'clock in the evening or something, everybody had to be in their barrack. So, and that's when the searchlights started and the dogs outside and all that sort of thing.
That must have been hard being apart from your dad.
No, not really. It wasn't. I mean, we knew we'd see him in the day. He just wasn't there at night with my mum and, and we were fine with Ralph and his mum and Neville. And, Mum protects us and we see our dad the next day.
And for Ralph, day-to-day life really wasn't all that bad. In fact, he had a rather sunny disposition reflecting on it all.
I cannot say that I ever came away being frightened by the camp in any way, simply because, as I've said, I believe it was large enough to absorb a young mind within the context of living. It was plenty going on, as it were.
Why do you think there is this difference of experience? For some people, it was this prison, this terrifying place to be, and for you and your brother, it was a playground. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because we were boys, and we had the comfort of being very close, and we also had the comfort of my mother being the teacher one of the teachers down at the school.
Hearing this took me aback a little. I hadn't considered that the people at the camp may have worked or gone to school. They even had a camp librarian who we'll hear about in a bonus episode of the podcast. So despite everything, they weren't consigned to do nothing.
Father worked at the Red Cross store with Mr. Matthews. They ran the Red Cross store, and it was not, I wouldn't say a cosy situation, but there was a generality about day to day. Mother went to teach, we went to school, we went to play, we came out and played. We had plenty of space to play. Day followed day. There were people doing theatricals and doing anything that a small society would do. Would come together, whether I don't know whether they did sap collecting or whatever, but there were things going on. And there was a theatrical group, and the older people did gymnastics out on the parade ground.
I was on the stage in the theatre at because they used to put on lots of shows there in Biberach. They were singing the Teddy Bear's Picnic, and I was a teddy bear.
So we were allowed to do most things with regard to keeping alive and passing the time of day.
And during his time working for the Red Cross, Ralph's dad kept a diary, which Ralph still has today, a wonderfully preserved red book. He actually got it out to show me. It's lined with thin paper and looks like an old school jotter.
This comes from the Red Cross stores. My father was the keeper of the instructions on it, and he kept that journal updated on a daily basis as to the coming and going of anybody of all nationalities, where they came from and where they went to. There was a multitude of people in there of all nationalities, but also records all the births that took place in the camp or in the other two hospitals which were close to Biberach. So there were a number of children, especially initially, because obviously we just come from Guernsey where life was going on normally. And some, obviously, women were pregnant when they arrived at the camp. But there was also arrival of babies during the later years.
Over the years, people have asked Ralph about the diary, and it has served as a useful trinket to flick back through from time to time for those curious about their family's past. And although it's simply a list of names, the diary also tells us a bit about some of the events that unfolded at the camp.
It also refers in there to the latter end of the war. We had a number of Jewish, North African Jews, who were, as I now know, were supposed to be going back to Italy. But because of the Allied advancements up Italy by the Americans and the British, they were cut off. So they got as far as Munich and were asked to turn right towards our camp. And they came into our camp. And there were two bodies split by a couple of days. We had 30 or plus the first day and about 60 or the other days. The interesting thing was that they were, as I say, North African Jews. They were in a pretty bad way, but they were being basically released by the Germans because they just were being overwhelmed by that time. It's an aside which probably shows that where they came from and how they thought that within 2 days of being in our camp, they were knocking on our barrack door. Would we give you 6 eggs for something? They were already bartering. I always remember seeing them at that door and asking my mother, what are they doing? Oh, they want to change something which they prefer to have.
The lives of objects, like this little red book, are often more fascinating than we realise. The journeys they go on, the meaning they hold for us, objects can tell 1,000 stories. We'll hear about some of the objects and artwork from Biberach that Dr. Gilly Carr has uncovered over the years.
Oh, there are thousands, there are absolute thousands.
But I want to stay on jobs for now. While Ralph's dad worked at the Red Cross and his mother actually worked within the camp, some deportees ended up working for the Germans.
You had them here, of course, in Guernsey and Jersey, but you're seen as collaborating, but you have a family, you have a wife, you have maybe elderly parents, you have children to feed, and the Germans may pay you, not a huge amount, but something to work. So what do? You're in the camps. For some of the men, you also have that same agonizing decision of, if I can get some work outside the camp, which some men could get, they get paid, so they're able to at least alleviate the boredom, and get some money and, the possibility of getting better rations, etc. But you're then seen as collaborating. So it's difficult.
And that was a decision my great-grandfather made. But as you'll hear, it certainly didn't give you a free pass.
Actually, my father used to go to work for the Germans, go on a lorry. When I say work for the Germans, he did that because he sort of felt they felt they had to do it, He used to go and pick bread up for the camp and stuff, and anything they could find. The Germans used to take them out working, I believe. They used to work them, the Germans. You know what they used to do. And when Ulm was being bombed, which is just down the road, my dad, they had to pick up bread, and it was full of glass. And they said, well, you did it, you eat it. And I remember that. I thought it's a bit gritty. But that was it was. And the first biscuit I ever had was a parcel that had been sent to Joy Godwin, that's Ralph's mum, from Canada. And we sat on the step with a little lump of butter and ate it. We cut it up, didn't we? We shared it, because that's what I learnt in the camp. Whatever you've got, you share with other people.
It must have fostered a really strong sense of community to be in it together like that. You're all there and none of you want to be, but you're helping each other out. You want to make sure that each of you gets through it. The community must have been strong in a way.
I think that, yes, it must have, people must have had strength from one another, definitely. And they had laughs together, and yeah, I think that experience must have strengthened people, and other people know. They never got over it, you see.
While we're on the subject of food, you'll be glad to hear that glass-filled bread wasn't the only thing they ate.
Well, we had potato peeling soup. I loved it. I went down once with my dad to the canteen. I was canteen in a soup kitchen. And I had a cup, and if you had a potato peeling, it was lovely. Ah, the smell of it as well, because I always wanted more, because you just had one cup. I don't know how many times a week you did that. I remember once a week. We had other food as well because of the Red Cross parcels. And that's the saviour. That's what, kept us going all right. So that was good.
Potato peeling soup. Not quite potato peel pie, but I have to admit, I'd kind of like to try it. But the rations, the infrequent deliveries, the limited options they had available to them, this wasn't just a matter of going hungry from time to time. For deportee Janet de Santos, this extended period of malnutrition had a severe impact on the rest of her life. She kept a glass of water next to her during our interview because her throat dries up really easily, which she tells me is a direct result of being in Biberach.
Well, I've got no lining to my throat. It just didn't develop because I didn't have proper food. Also, I've had a lot of problems with my bone structure for the same reason, because my bones didn't develop properly. And when I was in my 40s, I think it was, something like that, my spine collapsed. I mean, as you can see, they managed to put it back together again. It got me walking. But, obviously, if at that age you're not eating properly, I mean, we didn't have, until the Red Cross parcels started coming through, I mean, it was bread, water and, potatoes, that was about it.
It's funny because I think your parents install on you that everything will be all right, and you absolutely believe them. I trusted them, and I thought, yes, we will, and we will go home.
As a father of two young girls myself, I found it quite moving to hear how the parents of Biberach shielded their children, considering what they must have been going through themselves. Because, of course, while they gave their children this sense of hope that they would one day return to Guernsey, no one really knew. It must have been torture. But even in this situation, my great-grandfather was still able to make moments in the camp special. What were Christmases like, or did you celebrate any?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. My dad made me a cardboard doll's house without lights. But it was lovely. It was 4 rooms and plain. Ah, it was great. I loved it. And of course he made me my shoes out of the rope from the Red Cross parcels. So I used to like those, and I used to take them off. I ran barefoot everywhere. They used to do the best they could for their children, the men. They made lots of stuff. And the women used to knit, and, they used to rip things up and make others' clothes for the children.
We had Canadian food parcels, which were elaborate affairs. They were almost twice as big as the usual Red Cross parcel. This was at Christmas, and it came with presents in a term of very nicely modelled chess sets, and also some games we didn't recognise, but they were wooden and really posh. I still have the chess set at home now.
For the Guernsey deportees, these must have been the moments that kept them strong. Small acts of kindness that kept them going. So it wasn't all misery. Grandma and Ralph even shared some funny moments. It seems they liked to play games with the Germans and pushed the limits of their patience.
There's a man called Gustav, and he had a limp. He had his polished boots. He's always sort of, like that. We used to run behind him, and we used to imitate him. We used to go, we used to imitate him, and he used to turn around, and that's it. So we thought that was funny, but we did that sort of thing. We did skipping and things,
part of the fun was, and of course the German guards could get very bored sitting nothing happening around there. So we were always playing and they were always watching us. We knew that we couldn't go too close to the barbed wire. There was a limit, probably something like 2 yards. If you got any closer, then they would be putting their rifles up. And then we flee to the nearest hut, the wooden huts, where you had a 2-foot clearance underneath. In a sense, there was 2-foot clearance, was very useful because there was these dark huts. There was a side, as I understand, not being an adult by that time, that things went on under those huts, which wasn't anything to do with children.
Nothing you were privy to.
Exactly, yes.
And some stories, well, they are funny only in hindsight.
Funny moment. We went down to the Red Cross station, Red Cross parcels, and we had to have a look around. I remember looking around and everybody started running off because I was the smallest, staying in the thinnest. And they ran off and they left me. And these big boots came in. Oh, God, he's going to shoot me. I said, hid in terror behind this box. And he looked down at me and he said, Rouse. I thought, stop me. I ran like mad and say, wait for me. And he was always saying that there, wait for me. I thought they're going to shoot me. Yeah, but that was funny, actually. You look back on it now, you know.
So life in Biberach was tough. It was isolating. It was a prison. But the deportees never lost their sense of humour or their rebellious spirit. And as children, full of curiosity, some days were a complete rush.
Things like which would excite one was seeing in the daytime American bombers coming over in 44, 45, which had been bombing Stuttgart and the surrounding cities there and turning. Occasionally you see the odd bomber in distress and somebody you could say, oh, he's down his parachute. But they would turn quite close in terms of 20 miles away, 30 miles away. You could say on a clear day. And then at night, of course, we could occasionally have the British and the French or any other night bombers came in. But we were not the only aircraft we ever saw that came close was towards the end of the war when two, call them Lucky Lightnings. They were lightning, a type of plane with twin bodies. And they scooped over, they dropped leaflets at one time to say, I think it was basically just updating the war on us, which the Germans weren't very happy because there was all these paper floating all over the place.
As aircraft filled the skies of a war-torn world, clearly they became something of a spectacle, as my grandma also recalled a couple of aircraft-related stories.
I do remember something that stands out in my mind. It's planes flying over and dropping silver bits. And I think that was to confuse the radar, apparently. But everybody that saw them come over used to cheer. And you couldn't do that, you had to stop. But and then I remember when Hitler they used to practice zooming over the camp, and he inadvertently smashed into the ground outside the camp. So everybody cheered, poor little thing. It goes to terrify me. Yeah.
Now, this story is very interesting because, as my grandpa explains, he heard the same story from Ralph, except Ralph's version was a little different.
He said there was an aircraft testing site close to Biberach, and he said one of their new jet aircraft flew over the camp and the tailplane fell off and it crashed in the woods, and everyone cheered. Now, there was, prior to that, I'd heard a story that the Hitler Youth used to buzz the camp and try and frighten the deportees who were in the camp by buzzing it, and one of them flew too low and clipped the clock tower, and landed in the woods and it crashed. Now, it seems to me that didn't happen twice. So I'm not sure which is the right story. Perhaps they both are, I don't know, but I think they're relating to the same event. But it just illustrates, really, how things get mixed up.
And Grandpa says, during the process of archiving all of the Guernsey Deportees material recently, he discovered numerous conflicts between some of the facts and stories of those in the camp. And these very subtle differences in their stories speaks to something much bigger, I think. How history isn't one story, though it may be told from just one perspective. But to truly understand what happened in our past, we have to hear it from all angles, all perspectives. Now, what I really want to know was what it was like to get ill in the camp. Were there doctors on hand? Were the Germans helpful? What was the provision of care and treatment like? Well, what was there would have been minimal and inadequate by modern medical standards. There were limited medical care facilities, and the care they did receive would have largely been from other internees. You see, the deportees came from all social classes. Craftsmen were represented, as well as teachers, clergymen, and 2 doctors who worked closely together with the camp nurse Annie Sig. So yet another scenario showcasing the power of community spirit in Biberach. But if you want a first-hand account, well, it turns out one day in the camp, Ralph fell seriously ill.
I had a very, very bad throat, not like the one I've got now, but at the time. And eventually the doctors at the camp decided that my throat was too bad and it was basically severe tonsillitis.
German doctors or?
No, English doctors it is, but in agreement with German doctors because they interplayed. And so one day I was called down with my mother at 6 o'clock in the morning down to the guard room, and another lady was with her little girl, and they were there, and we were then instructed that the mothers would go away, and there was a guard there with his rifle over his shoulder, and he would be taking us to hospital. And we perceived that 2 little children with this guard all the way the mile down the hill to the hospital. And we went in there. We went through to a ward where there were 2 nuns sitting there on chairs who had masks and chloroform ready for us. And we had to go and sit on their lap, and then they chloroformed us. We woke up on a red rubber bed, as you do after an operation. We would now had tonsils cut, and a couple of hours later, they decided, you're all right now. But they were kind enough to supply a staff car, German staff car, which took us back to the camp. But to no any special look, just back to your barracks, into your straw paillasse. That was it. And your only comfort then would be a glass of water. And that was it. Get better soon, you might say.
These are just a handful of the many experiences people went through during their time in the camp. Historian Dr. Gilly Carr has captured many, many more through her time speaking to and becoming friends with the deportees, many of whom have passed away over the years. Gilly also finds value in telling the story of history through the lives of objects.
There's a particular category of artefact that I've now seen about 12 or more of, and that is an engraved camp mug. So when the deportees arrived, initially they were given pottery mugs, but these soon broke. But a little later in the war, they were given aluminium mugs. And there was one deportee called Bill Balcom. And in the First World War, he had engraved shell cases because that was one of the things that people in the trenches did. But during the Second World War, when he was in Biberach, he engraved people's mugs. And he was very skilled at this, and he would engrave them as gifts or as christening mugs. Many of the deportees had them as children born in the camp who had these mugs. I mean, I have one because an antiques guy in Jersey several years ago had one, and he asked me if I wanted to buy it. And I thought, well, it's very useful when I'm giving lectures to show this example. But they're typically engraved with the names of the person who they're for, and lots of flowers and plants, but also they show views beyond the barbed wire. So some of these sort of famous views from Biberach camp, but also they show views inside barrack huts as well of the bunk beds and the stools. And I think they're great from that because they really give you this vision of the camp. But at the bottom, there's something very clever on them. Now, Bill Balcombe was known as Bill Balcombe of Everest. And it wasn't because he'd climbed Mount Everest, but he would draw the profile of the mountain range on the bottom of the mug. And the mountain range would clearly have a bit missing, like it would have a bite taken out of it. And the children, I call them children, they're, these are people no longer alive now, but the children who received these mugs said to me, oh yes, he would say that this chunk taken out of the mountain, if ever there was world peace, that chunk would go back in the mountain. And so it sort of showed that they were still at war. And because he told this story, he was Bill Balcombe of Everest. And after a while, and it took me longer than it should have done, I realized that when you turn that mug sideways, that mountain range is actually a man's profile. And you can see his nose and his lips and his chin. And there's also on the bottom of these mugs a little, what I'd thought was a little V for victory, but it was actually a sideways view of the eye, sort of drawn as a V. And so, Bill really put his own very personal stamp on the bottom of these mugs because it was him. But
really
those are
like
brilliant. I love those. But there's also fascinating things made out of tin cans because the Red Cross would deliver food parcels. And the idea was that everyone got one food parcel per person per week. But that wasn't always the case. But nonetheless, within this parcel is a whole lot of raw materials for making objects. So you've got the wooden crate in which all of the parcels arrive. You've got wood. You've got the cardboard from the parcels. You've got the packing material. Instead of using styrofoam or whatever you would use today, they have, or bubble wrap, they had these strips of coloured plastic, thin strips of coloured plastic, which the deportees would weave and thread into things. There was the parcel string, which deportees would unravel and plait and turn them into shoes and all sorts of things. There were the tins. There were food tins. All sorts of things were tinned. There was tinned cheese and all sorts of stuff which doesn't come in tins today, but came in tins then. Tins of cigarettes, and which would be wrapped in cellophane, and they would use that cellophane and they would plait it and make pretty pearlescent things. So all sorts of things made of tin, cardboard, string, plastic strips came from the camps, and people bought a lot of it home. And so there were hats, handbags, purses, hair curlers, trays, all sorts of things made from these. So I mean, in the Occupation Museum in Guernsey, for example, they've got some hair curlers made out of bits of tin, so the women could still try and change their appearance so they didn't look like bedraggled, dirty prisoners, but instead could keep up their morale by styling their hair and maybe making little handbags with coloured threads to lift a dirty outfit, and pair of slippers woven out of parcel string, again because their shoes would have been falling apart. And so I think you can see how people are, it's a way of fighting back against the Germans. It's a form of resistance that they might be keeping you as dirty, disheveled prisoners, but damn it, you're not going to let them get you down, and you're going to show that actually, no, you can hold your chin up because you can, be something other than they're trying to make you be.
Do you think it helped to empower them and feel in control of a situation which could otherwise feel helpless?
Yes.
To be able to have this ability to, this ingenuity, this art, this creativity?
Yes, definitely. And you find people making things out of red, white and blue as well. And from the artwork, you can see that people had patriotic interior design, if I can call it that. They would make Union Jacks to pin on the walls. They would make V signs, which they would hang above the door. You might have heard about the carnival that was an August bank holiday carnival, I think in 1943 in Biberach, I'd have to check the year, where they held a fancy dress carnival, and the Germans made a cine film of it, a propaganda cine film, to show, oh, look what fun people have in camps. Look how well we take care of our prisoners. But every barrack block put forward an entry, and at the point at which that cine film got converted to video in the 1980s, one former deportee, Eric Sirrett, provided the voiceover. He's no longer alive, but I interviewed his son in one of the early days of my research. He said he was talking about that he remembered that people would make outfits representing St. George and the Dragon, Britannia, and Uncle Sam, one of the allies. And so people were making very patriotic costumes as a way of still keeping their national identity. And I think there was a big sort of pride in being British and having a stiff upper lip and showing the Germans they couldn't get you down. And yes, so very much you see a lot of that sort of resistance going on.
And resistance and liberation is the subject we're turning to next, as we find out how it felt for the deportees to learn that the war was over, that they were being released from their prison, and what it was like to return to Guernsey, an island that had changed in many ways since their departure.
They're being completely away, possibly from families, and away from their homes at that crucial time in their lives. So when they come back, there's an attitude that people aren't quite the same again here.
They were fighting for the town towards the end of war. I know that there were tanks in a field. There were tanks in a field because I could hear the shells, could hear them. But my mother, in the meantime, had pulled us under the bunk and told us to get down. We were going home.
Liberation Day at last. After 3 long years in captivity came a day that will be remembered for the rest of time. News had made it to the camp. The Allies had won the war, and the islanders in Biberach were given their first promise of freedom.
I quickly packed my bag, actually, packed my panda, put in my bag, and went and joined her under the bed. And then I wanted to know when we were going home. But we had to wait a few weeks for that.
Unfortunately, winning the war didn't mean a straight path home for these islanders, this community. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of waiting. It wasn't even clear that they'd ever see Guernsey again. Just like the path into the camp, the path out was long and winding.
When we went on to, because we were relieved slightly before Guernsey, and we were out on the camp listening to the big loudspeaker box as when Churchill came out. I remember listening to him. Obviously, we didn't have a clue who Churchill was and why like that, but obviously our parents were very, very taken by it. To be standing in Germany free, hearing that, was something I do remember.
And our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today.
We were rescued by the French Moroccan troops, which they were a bit, surly. You wouldn't speak to them. Don't go near them. And then the Americans came, and that's the first time we've tasted chocolate and had chewing gum, and I'll never forget them. They're the first soldiers I saw smile ever. So I'll always remember them and thank them. They took us around the town and then brought us back up. It was interesting to see it.
So at the time of the liberation of the camp, were you sort of swarmed by Allied troops then, and they came and...
Well, the people who liberated us were a French tank squadron who made sure that they dealt with the Hitler Youth camp below us first and then turned up. But there were French around, and then very quickly American soldiers were around. The end of the war was happening around us. The Russians were coming in from one side, French were coming in from them, the Americans from there. I believe the French moved on, but a little aside, when we were allowed out into Biberach to see the town, we were told and given a red, white and blue Union Jack to put on one's shirts. This was to make sure that people were not Germans when we went to the camp, because there were a lot of French troops who were African French, West African French British. They could be inclined to shoot anybody who looked like a German. These symbols for them to be recognised. But luckily, I think they moved on within 2 or 3 weeks.
Do you remember the feeling in the camp? Were people crying?
I think there was an excitement about it. And we were very quickly moved on from the camp, but not immediately sent from Germany. We were sent to a holding camp on an airfield where the Americans and Canadians were. It was a grass airstrip, which is now much more, about 40 miles away from Biberach, which is now a Ryanair, as I understand it.
And it was here at this airstrip that each family had to wait with bated breath, hoping and praying for the news that it would finally be their turn to fly.
I drove out of that camp in a lorry when I was that age, and they took us to this holding, it had tents, and they wrote up who was flying. You know, you were given numbers when you're going to fly, and all to do with your name and everything like that. And we were one of the last planes to go out because W. And I used to go down every day and look at the notice board and see if it was our turn to fly. I wanted to fly. And anyway, we did this day. We got on a plane. It was a Dakota, and it had parachutes hanging from it. And I sat with my dad on a bench, and my mum had my brother, and it was an electrical storm we flew through. And I think that affected my hearing in my left ear. I had trouble ever since that. Anyway, then, of course, we went to Burnley. That's the last time I was in Biberach and in Germany. And then, of course, as Alan said, we drove over the line inadvertently. I couldn't wait to get out. Talk about flying. Put your foot down. Yeah.
It was interesting to me to hear how this flight could have been what caused my grandma's hearing loss. How this one event so many years ago had a ripple effect throughout her life. Not just emotionally, but physically too. Just as it did for Janet, who, as we discovered previously, has no lining in her throat due to malnutrition. Shortly, we'll explore the lifelong impact the camp has had on the deportees and the lasting legacy of this piece of history. But first, back to Liberation Day and the moment when the flight that Grandma was waiting so patiently for had arrived.
We ended up in Burnley, staying with a grocer. He got a tablecloth out. I asked if it was somebody's birthday, because Mrs. Godwin had a cloth she used to put out for people's birthdays. They were nice people. That's where I thought I'd stay. I thought it was my home till I realised and then we were told we were going to Guernsey. So that's what I remember.
Ralph left the airstrip with the Canadian Air Force on a propeller-driven aircraft called the Douglas DC-3, which was used during the war to transport paratroopers and glider-borne troops behind enemy lines.
We flew from there to Northolt in London.
So Burnley, London, the deportees ended up all over the place. They didn't just return to Guernsey, they were split up and sent to many different parts of the UK. Janet ended up in the south.
We stayed in Devon because my father had an aunt and uncle who had retired to Devon. And rather than coming directly back to Guernsey, we stayed for a short period in Devon.
And for some people, the UK became their permanent home, and they never did come back to the island. Some had lost everything, while others may have had family elsewhere or simply wanted a fresh start. For others, well, not everyone survived the journey back. Others were too weak to travel immediately and may have died in medical facilities in France or Germany. And then there are those who had died in the camp while the war was still raging. Did people die in the camp while you were there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't remember offhand how many, but quite a few. Yeah. And they honour their memory the same day as the 23rd of April, where we honour our day over here. So at the same time, they're doing their service and we're doing our service here.
But many, many deportees were keen to return home, as you might imagine. But 3 years on, the island felt very different to them.
It's strange, actually, because we came back by boat and I wondered what my family looked like. I pictured princesses and people like that, and no, not quite like that. Poor little devils. They were thin as well. We were very thin and they were thin. So they'd been through a lot over here as well. I remember that, and then going up to live with my grandma, because that's the only reason we could get back, because we had to establish we had a place to come to, apparently. And I remember being with my grandma and then going down to live in Route Isabel.
Yes, so apparently there's something quite amusing. When we got back, my cot was ready for me, kind of in our house where we lived. But unfortunately, I'd grown, so so I didn't fit into it. But I don't really remember, and just that. I mean, I had a very happy childhood in Coburg, and one thing. My parents wanted to send me to a private school here in St. Peter Port, and I just refused to go. A bus used to come and stop, and I'd refuse to get on it. And so in the end, they gave up, and I was allowed to go to the local school, the Cattell school, with the local children. And that for me was fine. And, that helped me, to get back into the local community and make friends, and that was the effect,
And while the children were able to bounce back, kids are resilient, the weight of what had happened seems to have weighed very heavily on the shoulders of the adults. Janet says her mum was never the same again.
I was told that my mother originally was very, loved singing. She played the piano beautifully. All this type of thing was very popular over here in the island. When she came back, she was a different person. She wouldn't play the piano anymore. Well, you can understand that when you've been under threat for 2.5 years, wondering what's going to happen to you. If I remember correctly, things I've heard, there were Jewish people who came to Biberach, and they were then, sent off on trains. It was just a stopping point prior to the extermination. Her brother, who managed to escape Vienna as well, and he came over to the UK with the Free Czech Army. And they obviously kind of met up again after the war. And the first time we went over to visit him, he actually had bought a piano for my mother, because he remembered her as somebody who was never, kind of far from a piano. And she just wouldn't sit down and touch it. I mean, she changed apparently, from what I hear. She was very, very different after to what she was before.
And is that something that carried with her for the rest of her life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't a happy. I think it just, stemmed enjoying things, basically.
And through all of this change, some who returned felt like strangers in their own homes. Another deportee is a woman called Jill Oliver. Jill is 90, so she was 7 when she boarded the cargo ship, and 10 when she was liberated from the camp. She now lives in the USA, and that's due, in part, to the feeling she and her family felt on arriving back to Guernsey after those 3 long years.
It was not long before we went to England. My dad's car was stolen, his boat, he had a sailboat, even the head was removed. Furniture in the house was all. My mother had fitted furniture made in, because they were quite wealthy in the island, and that was totally robbed from them. All the fitted furniture were pulled out of the walls and put in one room. At least it was put in one room. Now, we have no proof whether it was the Germans or the people on the island that did that. And Dad could not start his practice again. I was born in 39 Arcade, and that's where he had his practice. Again, it was a matter of them accepting us. My dad started 2 of his sons in the Pollock, up in a business, a jewelry business. That got them started, but my dad couldn't do his dentistry anymore there, so we all went to England, and he associated, because he was much older, and to start doing another dental business was too hard on him. So he really didn't have a good life, my poor dad. But he loved America. He did end up coming, and he's buried here.
And Jill's was not an isolated experience, as Dr. Gilly Carr came to find out through her research.
One of the things that I realised right at the end of the book was the story of people coming back to the Channel Islands and finding their houses were looted. Somebody else was living in their house. Their business, their shop had been taken over by someone else. Basically, people came back to find they'd lost everything. And, you know, the kids had lost out on their education. People had lost out on earning money. And I think that these sorts of anecdotes are known, and they're known to have happened to a few people. But when I was doing my research, I found that it seems to have happened to everybody, that everybody came back to find, almost everybody came back to find their houses had been looted, that their house had been destroyed, that they basically had to come back and arrive back destitute and had to build up again. And I think this is much more common than has ever been acknowledged before. I think before it was assumed to have happened to a minority, but I think it was actually the majority.
Now, one thing that changed dramatically after the war was, of course, the language. In pre-war Guernsey, many people spoke Genesiez or Guernsey French. Although its use had declined over the years, around 25% of Guernsey's population still spoke it as their primary language. Many more understood it but preferred to use English. But, as Matt Lucas explains, by the end of the war, its decline accelerated.
Language-wise, it's not quite the death knell of the language, but it's a big thing. Because obviously a huge amount of young people go. They're the future of the language. They have several years in the UK. They're not speaking the language. They come back and you can see a sharp decline in the use of the language. It's the same in Jersey, of course, to 1945. So certainly there's a big impact in the language, big impact then in the culture. You know, I'd said at the start how life hadn't really changed much here for hundreds of years. Obviously, there's little bits it had. But after 1945, you see there is quite a change, certainly in culture when it comes to the language. These young people have been away 1940 to 45, whether they were in camps or whether they were evacuated to British cities. So when they come back, there's an attitude that people aren't quite the same again here. How has the land changed? Well, you can just drive around Guernsey and you will see the huge amount of concrete that the Germans have put in around the coast. To start with, those mines are there, the barbed wire is there. So it takes, a few years for all that to be cleared. And obviously the ground to be sculpted and made to look nicer. Scrap metal drives, cutting up the German guns that are still here. And then getting used to island life. So it changes a considerable amount. Go to somewhere like Alderney, which obviously the civilians are vast majority are evacuated in 1940. They come back. Alderney's really in ruins. It's completely wrecked. The Germans have taken everything out of the houses, anything they could burn in the end. Roofs have gone, doors, it's in the houses. Alderney's an absolute mess. And obviously you have a much darker history in Alderney. But it's quite different when the civilians get back. And as I said, for those children, 5 years away, 5 years for an adult is quite something. But for a child, your formative years, the impact is felt, and it will be really ever since, subconsciously as well as consciously. You go through a traumatic experience like that, it will affect you, but it will also affect future generations. They've done quite a few studies of people that were in places like Auschwitz, and that trauma does get passed on in all sorts of different ways. Food, freedom, things that you just really wouldn't think about. Now, of course, it's more of a tourist destination to do with that. But for the locals, 1945, 46, 47, 48, most of them weren't thinking that. They just wanted their old lives back and to just get rid of the thoughts of the occupation.
Now, this is just one of the lasting legacies of the war on Guernsey. We'll dig into other ways in which the Guernsey deportees' lives were forever altered by their experience, and why, 50 years later, they decided to make a return trip to the camp where they were once interned. And then when you went back to Biberach, what was that like?
I think it's terrible. I felt terrible.
It's 2012, 67 years since the end of the war. By now, the face of Guernsey has truly shifted, having established itself as a financial hub. The site of bunkers and fortifications on the island's coastlines, now just a tourist's curiosity. But it is in 2012 that the deportees decide to go back, to return to Biberach.
And I think my parents, I honour and respect them. And that's why I went back to Germany. And that's it really, just to do that for them. And all those years ago I went back, I couldn't go back again. I wanted to pay them homage, basically. So I don't know how they did it, these people. They're brave parents, very brave.
But it wasn't just about paying respect to her parents that brought Grandma back to this place that she could barely speak about for decades. This was something she needed to do for her.
I went home with Alan because I couldn't go in a coach. And we drove up the hill and he said, "You didn't walk all this way?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, it's just up here." I said, "No, round the corner." So we had a long way to walk up the hill. And I stopped outside and I said to Alan, "I don't know if I can do it." Anyway, I said, "Well, I've come here all this way and I'll regret it." But I thought to myself, if I go back, and I really want to honour my dad and mum. So anyway, we went in and I just stood there and cried. Just couldn't move. And anyway, I thought, no, I'm here now. And so I stayed and went to the museum and saw the cars that I remembered and the dress uniforms they used to wear, the Germans and stuff. And that's the last time I've been back.
This was a visceral experience. Judging by the look on Grandma's face as she told me what it was like, visiting Biberach was intensely emotional, difficult but necessary. But it wasn't just important for her. Grandpa too learnt a lot about his wife there in Germany.
What we haven't said was that although we went back to Biberach, we couldn't actually stay in the town. Jill didn't want to stay there, so we stayed outside in Bad Bacau. So we just used to drive in there every day. I wouldn't say I was unaware of the trauma that she was going through, but she kept it to herself, very much so. I was quite amazed. First thing that amazed me really was I'd heard her telling about her walking up the hill from Biberach town up to the camp, and she had described the walking and all that sort of thing. And when we drove up there in the car, she actually remembered exactly where the camp was. So I knew that was a memory that was her memory and not something anyone had told her, because she said, "Oh no, we just go round the corner, it's at the top." And of course now that camp is a police training academy.
A police training academy, a far cry from the internment camp it had once been. And the people, well, they were welcoming, friendly, apologetic even. Going back, Grandma says Biberach was
completely different. They'd re-landscaped it, so because it's a police academy. But the only thing that they had saved was the clock tower from the administration block. And that clock tower, I said to somebody years ago, Sabine, I think, it'd be nice if they kept it. That's the only thing that's left standing. And they left standing in their grounds. It's been done up. I think it's in a museum or in the grounds still, but at least they preserved it. So that's the only thing that remains of the camp.
For you, did some of the memories come flooding back when you went to Biberach? Did you picture yourself again at the age of 4 or 5 in certain places?
I did, yeah. especially standing where my old barrack was. And that was upsetting, because the last time I was there was when I was 5.5, and I was with my mum and dad and my brother, who's no longer here either. That's what really upset me. But I knew I had to do it for them, so yeah, that's what I did. You do it for anybody, you know. And you honour your mother and father, because they put up so much. I mean, young people like that, helping us to get through it.
Grandma mentioned her brother there, Keith, who died a number of years ago. I wanted to know how Biberach impacted him.
Badly. He was never the same. He hated the Germans. He wouldn't talk about them. We used to laugh sometimes about things that happened, but he was very, very anti. So therefore he wouldn't talk about it. That was it, really. It upset him emotionally, and he wasn't very well with it as well, so it didn't help him, to talk about it. It affected him greatly. I think, from what I understand, when the police came knocking at the door, my brother was with my mother, and there's a man in uniform, was a German actually, not police, and I think that shook Keith. I think he's frightened at the shouting and commanding, and I think that helped to make him not very well. He stammered badly. That's in Germany he started stammering. For the rest of his life he was like that.
So it wasn't even just the time in the camp, it was a lasting thing all the way through.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
His stammer was brought on, you think, by the trauma?
Yes, yeah, the traumatic experience of going and, meeting this man at the door, commanding man. And I think it's the whole experience of before and after, in the camp and afterwards.
Because he was obviously a bit older than you, so I guess it hit him harder in a way.
Yeah. I don't know what he remembered of it, because we never talked about it.
Keith, or Uncle Keith as I call him, suffered greatly, and for him it was better not to talk about his time at Biberach. But for Grandma, spending just a week out there with Grandpa profoundly changed things for her, and in a way, unburdened her.
We stayed out in Buckbaden. I think we were there for a week, roughly, and that was interesting as well. The man that owned the hotel, I think his father was connected to Biberach sometime in the war, and he apologised lots of times, poor man, eh? Yeah, they're nice people. I met some nice teenagers in Biberach. They were the same. They couldn't do enough to help you. So it had changed a lot. But the only thing that I really enjoyed is I was asked to go to a monastery somewhere. I didn't mind going, so I went to that. But I'd like to have the freedom to say no, because they'd bossed me around for so many years. And I did say no on a couple of occasions. And I thought, got ya. I thought it's lovely to have freedom of choice. You can't take that away from you. Definitely, you can't beat it. So that is total freedom.
So, although this was a tough experience that challenged Grandma in many ways, it also did her a world of good.
Yes, it did. It did me a lot of good. And it's like a chip off your shoulder, not like that, but mentally. And I thought, yes, I've done what I had to do. That's the last chapter I'll do. But it's not, you see, because it goes on and on. I mean, Ralph has come here today and Janet to talk to you. And it does carry on. And I think it will if youngsters remember it and not forget and try to put themselves probably not in our position, but to understand, and to realise what we went through to get back home.
Did it start another chapter for you?
Yes, and I'm still here. It's chapters ago, and I think this will be the last chapter. But as we said, it gets easier. You can handle it more, but it's still very poignant. And I talk about it, but I won't be able to do much talking about it for the next couple of days or so. But it's easier to remember because I'm more at peace with myself.
Do you think the journey ever ends?
No, don't think it does. The journey never ends until the day you die. Then it carries on somewhere else. I believe you learn all the time. You learn something about different people. All the time in your life, you learn something. But I feel now I want to reach out outwardly to people that are hurting. And I like to talk to them and really reassure them that everything's all right, if that makes sense. That's how I feel. People talk to me when I play petanque and about whatever they're suffering and stuff. And I really want to help them. Probably that's a good thing. So you never stop learning about people and yourself.
So this welcome reception, this newfound connection, it has all fostered some amazing relationships. A moment of reconciliation that paved the way for a much needed shift, which, as Gilly Carr explains, made a real difference in the lives of the deportees.
I think for some it's been transformational. When we went in 2006, the local rector, the pastor, gave a sermon in the church where he apologised for what had happened during the war. And we all knew it wasn't, he wasn't born then, it wasn't his fault, but he was apologising on behalf of the Germans, the German nation, whatever. And even though, it wasn't like it was an apology coming from the chancellor or the leader or anyone like that, but it was just coming from him. And many of the deportees started to cry, and I cried as well because I could just feel how they were feeling. For some, hearing that was so important for they themselves to come to terms with what had happened in the past. And one man afterwards went up to the pastor and shook his hand and said, I didn't want to come to Biberach. I've always hated Germans and hated, my life has been really badly impacted by being in the camp, but let me shake your hand. Thank you for saying that. That's really meant the world to me. And he came back again the following year. And I think being able to face that past, because the camp remains in the memory as a place covered in barbed wire, with guards in uniform, with dirt and filth and not enough food and all of these things. And to see it again in the present, invariably in the summer, no barbed wire, welcoming people, lots of food, lots of kindness, flowers, it can act in some way, I think, to replace the dark images in your head. And it can be very, I always say that reconciliation is a process. It's not a moment, although it might have been a moment for that man, but it can be a long journey, and it's something that has to happen individually for each person. It's not a matter of the bailiff standing up and saying, we are reconciled. It's a matter of each individual person feeling that they've reached a place of healing, or whatever you want to call it, inside themselves, where they can say, actually, these people are all right. And I remember Tom Renfrey saying to me when I think it was around about his 90th birthday, I was chatting to him, and he said, he now counts the people of Biberach among his friends. And he said, when he first went to Biberach, he held a lot of, was it hatred? Maybe not hatred, a lot of resentment in his heart. And he went to the school to give a talk to local school children. He said, how can I hold resentment against these kiddies? It's not their fault. It's nothing to do with them. And I think that the process of experiencing it today, of meeting people, of receiving kindness and warmth, and sometimes an apology, can go a very, very long way. And I remember the following year when I went to Würzburg, and the pastor stood up in the church service and said, I'm not going to apologize because it's too late for that. My apology would be meaningless. And I thought to myself, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. I think people still need to hear it, and maybe they need to hear it again and again and again, because that shows that you mean it.
What this underscored to me was the true value of an apology.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've seen it for myself, and I've seen how much it moves people and how much people need to hear it. They need to hear it, even if it's 80 years later. and it can be transformational.
As you'll have gathered from hearing the differing stories of Ralph and Grandma and Janet, that these stories are passed down in fragments rather than in a complete form. They differ from person to person, begging the question, what can we define as historically accurate? In many cases, Gilly had to interview family members because it wasn't possible to speak to the person who was deported themselves, as they'd passed away before she began her research. And Gilly says this is a big problem when it comes to remembering what happened.
I think collections get passed down, collections of objects. Sometimes they get thrown away. But whenever I interviewed the people who had not been there, they did not have the stories, quite remarkably so. And they would often have, if they did have stories, they were inaccurate, very incomplete, they were told wrong. And so very early on, I knew not to. I could follow up leads that they might have suggested and to find out the true story, especially as there were still people I could still ask who were still alive, but very much the stories passed down were rarely accurate. I'm not saying they were all wholly inaccurate, but I'm saying that they had not been remembered correctly. But they had the collections of objects. And so many times I would say to the grandchild or the child who had inherited these objects, I'd say, what's the story behind this? And they would say, oh, I don't know. Oh, it was made in such and such a camp. And perhaps they themselves had not asked the story about objects. Or I think what I'm seeing, I think, is that if I can refer back to those who were sent to concentration camps and labour camps from the Channel Islands, they did not tell the next generation what had happened. They really didn't speak to it's mostly men who were sent away, not wholly, but mostly men. They would never tell their wives of what happened to them. They would never tell their children. They would not want to pass that horror onto those who loved them. And I think there might be an element of that, of wanting to protect the next generation by not really wanting to tell them too much. I think it's great that your grandmother has told you her stories, and I hope that you'll remember them and remember them correctly. But for the most part, the next generation might have the objects, but not the stories. And I think by being able to write my book, I can tell those stories. And when you've seen many collections, you start to see repetitions and patterns, and you start to say, okay, well, I've seen those sorts of slippers before. I know who made them. I've definitely seen one of those engraved mugs before. Oh, they've got some hair curlers. I know the story there. Oh, they've got one of them. Yes, I know about those. And you start to see a lot of repetition. And so hopefully the story of the objects is told in the book such that people coming along with new collections might be able to slot it right in and to say, okay, I see what those stories were.
Speaking of stories being passed down, there's one story Grandma shared with me long before I thought about making this podcast that has really stuck with me. And I think it's one of the most defining moments in her journey. How, when she was at a wedding in Mallorca, she saw a young couple cradling their baby, just a tiny thing. And every time the baby saw her, it would smile. It seemed to have taken a real liking to her. At some point, the parents let her hold the child, and it was only then that she found out that they were from Germany. And it was at that moment, seeing this innocent child and its parents, that she realised she couldn't hold on to her hatred of the Germans anymore. It was a moment of realisation that it wasn't the fault of the new and upcoming generations. They didn't do this to her. It was then that she knew it was time to let go of some of that deep-seated anger that she'd held onto for so many years. Now, one piece of the lasting legacy of all of this is the German fortifications that still adorn the coastlines of Guernsey. Bunkers, gun emplacements, tunnels, observation towers. For many, these are sites of historical importance, or mere curiosities. But for Jill Oliver, they are a constant reminder of a past she'd sooner forget.
I wish they'd get rid of the cannons and the bunkers, because it's such a peaceful island. It's a beautiful island. That reminds you of death. Who wants to be reminded of death? And look at Alderney. Have you been to Alderney? Oh, that was so cruel. So cruel.
I'm keen for you to know that I'm not just sharing this story with you to give you an insight into what happened to these few people. This, to me, is a story that spans the generations because it speaks to something much, much bigger. The power of freedom and the pain of having it ripped away. It's a lesson that we need to learn from. And with everything that's going on in the world right now, it's a lesson we need to hear more urgently than ever.
Coming away from Germany, you realise how precious peace and freedom of body, freedom of will is very important. And that's one of the things you learn. And I would hope that people can learn that without going to wars. Except you've got people that want lots of power, greed and strength. But hopefully one day people will learn.
A recent development and a nod to the lasting legacy of the deportations are the Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, that have been erected. 15 in Guernsey and 20 in Jersey. My grandma was part of the steering group that brought them to the island.
And these commemorate people that were involved during the occupation and involved in resistance activities. It's not resistance generally as we imagine. A lot of them died in various German prisons and German camps. Again, it's quite different what happens compared to what happens later. And some of them did survive. Frankfurter will be a very famous example of someone who was a resistor, if you think of the Guernsey, the Underground News Service, etc. And they're really all over the island, those 15. It's a very interesting topic that we need. You could do a whole podcast on that alone.
And maybe one day I will. Among the people named on the stones laid in Guernsey are 3 Jewish women who were all deported and later died in Auschwitz concentration camp. And also being honoured is Janet's mother, Elizabeth. Now, I want to leave you with this lasting thought. For anyone who's ever been afraid to share their story or wondered whether they should.
I think you've got to have the strength to do it, the courage to be able to tell the truth. That's what I live by, really.
Thank you for listening to this important documentary. If this is your kind of history, stories about how ordinary people lived through extraordinary times, subscribe to What We Did Before, the podcast where each week we explore the forgotten ways humans lived before the modern world. You can find that wherever you're listening now. Until next time.